It was late October. I was driving alone, taking a back road through the northern part of Vermont to get to a hunting cabin I had rented for a week. I had been here once before, but that was in the summer, and the trees had been full and the trails marked clearly. This time, the forest was bare, and the ground was damp from weeks of rain, turning everything into a patchwork of mud and leaves. The sun had already set by the time I left the highway, and I had to rely on my headlights to see the narrow, winding road ahead. At first, the drive felt normal, slow because of the curves and occasional potholes. The road twisted between hills, over creeks, and past abandoned houses that were overgrown and collapsing. I didn't see anyone else for miles, and I remember thinking that I hadn't passed a single car since I left the highway. After about 45 minutes, the road I was on split. I hadn't been paying much attention, so I followed what seemed like the main path, though it was narrower and the pavement was more broken. After a few miles, I realized the road was disappearing. Not physically, but my sense of direction and the landmarks no longer made sense. There were forks, but no signs, no reflective posts, nothing to guide me. My phone had no signal, and the GPS couldn't locate me. I stopped at a particularly wide fork in the road, trying to figure out which way to go. The trees on both sides pressed in close, skeletal and brown, the branches clacking lightly in the wind. The road under my tires seemed to shift slightly, like the mud was deeper on one side, but I couldn't tell which way was actually the main path. I started driving again, picking the left fork. It felt wrong almost immediately. The road narrowed even more and began to rise steeply, winding around a hill I didn't recognize. I glanced back once, and I could have sworn the path I had just come from looked different, like the fork had never existed. My heart started beating faster. I stopped the car, took out my map, and tried to orient myself, but the forest had swallowed all familiar markers. The cabin I had planned to reach was supposed to be off this road in less than 2 miles, and yet I felt like I had driven for nearly an hour and still hadn't passed anything recognizable. As the darkness deepened, the only sound was the engine and the occasional crunch of leaves under the tires. I kept expecting to see a sign, a driveway, or even the faint glow of the cabin's lights, but there was nothing. I felt trapped in the trees themselves, the forest dense on either side, and the road under me no longer felt like a road so much as a path cut through chaos. At one point, I noticed tire tracks ahead, partially covered in leaves. They were not fresh, but they suggested someone had driven this way before. I followed them, hoping they would lead somewhere, but the tracks seemed to disappear into a muddy slope, vanishing entirely. My anxiety was rising. I began to check my phone repeatedly, hoping for a signal, but there was none. I tried calling the rental service for directions, but the call wouldn't go through. I thought about turning back, but every time I tried, I felt the road behind me shift as if the hill itself had moved. At one point, I had to stop because the incline became steep and slick with mud. I considered getting out to check, but the forest felt oppressive. The wind picked up, and it carried a sharp smell of decay, which I couldn't place at first. I thought maybe it was a dead animal, but it was too strong, too pervasive. Hours seemed to pass as I drove, but I couldn't have been moving more than a few miles. Eventually, I came to a point where the road literally ended in a patch of thick forest. There was no continuation, just trees and brush that rose as far as I could see. I got out to look, shining my flashlight, and noticed tire ruts leading into the forest. Someone had driven off the road, but there were no footprints. I felt a rising panic. I had no choice but to back up and try the other fork. The other fork was worse. The incline was steeper, and the mud made me slide constantly. My tires spun, and I had to get out several times to push the car, leaving marks in the mud. The forest seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain, branches scratching the sides of the car as if trying to hold me back. The wind carried whispers, though I tried to convince myself they were just branches brushing together. My mind was on edge. Every turn looked the same, and the road seemed to loop back on itself. I drove for what felt like hours, stopping only to rest briefly, eat some snacks, and check the time. It was now deep into the night, and the forest was completely silent except for my car. I realized the road had disappeared completely in some stretches, leaving me to drive on a mixture of mud, rocks, and leaves, hoping it led somewhere. I considered abandoning the car, but I didn't know which way to go, and I was afraid of walking into the trees in the dark. Eventually, I came to a clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by trees, but in the center was a cabin. It wasn't mine. It was old, boarded up, and the windows were dark. I parked and got out to look at it. There were no signs of life, no smoke from a chimney, nothing. I turned around and realized the road behind me had vanished. I couldn't see the path I had driven. The clearing felt isolated, like the trees themselves had shifted to surround me. I stayed in the car the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep, but the cold kept me in the seat. By first light, I managed to get a weak signal and called a tow service explaining I was lost. They gave me directions using landmarks I had never seen and told me the road I had been on was considered abandoned decades ago, even though it appeared on some maps. When the tow truck arrived, it took me back to the highway in less than 20 minutes. Looking back, I have no explanation for how I got lost. The road I followed didn't match any maps, and the paths seemed to change overnight. I had been invited to join a small hunting trip in northern Maine. It was late October, and the leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the forest looking gray and skeletal. I didn't know the area well, but one of the guys insisted he knew a remote cabin where we could stay and hunt. I didn't care much about hunting, but I wanted the solitude and the experience of being deep in the woods before winter fully arrived. We drove in during the afternoon, the road narrowing to gravel and then to dirt. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low, and the forest was cold and damp. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs, and it had clearly been used before, though not recently. The smell of old wood and smoke hung faintly in the air, and there was a fire pit outside that hadn't been used this season. After settling in, the group decided to split up the next day to hunt. I volunteered to go with the least experienced guy, mostly because I didn't want to get lost alone. Our plan was simple: follow a creek up into the hills and circle back by mid-afternoon. I brought water, some snacks, and my phone, though I didn't expect to have a signal once we were deep in the woods. The first few hours were normal. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird and the sound of the creek. The trail became less defined, turning into a mixture of mud, fallen leaves, and rocks. Around midday we spotted tracks. Not deer or bear, something larger. At first, I assumed it was a moose, but the spacing was strange, uneven. My companion noticed it too, and we debated following it or turning back. He wanted to keep going. I reluctantly agreed. We followed the tracks for nearly an hour. They led us deeper into a part of the forest that was unfamiliar, and the creek we had been following disappeared under fallen trees and rock piles. I started feeling uneasy. The tracks we were following had no clear pattern, and at one point, they split in two directions. We took the right path, which led us uphill. The forest thickened, and the wind picked up. I began to lose the sense of direction, and I noticed that every time I tried to look back, the trail we had come from seemed to blend into the trees, like it had never existed. I suggested we turn back, but my companion insisted we were close to where the tracks ended. That's when we saw it, a small, dilapidated structure partially hidden behind trees. At first, I thought it was another hunting cabin, but it was different, roughly built, no windows, the door hanging off its hinges. The smell hit me immediately, a combination of mold, decay, and something metallic I couldn't identify. I hesitated, but curiosity pushed me forward. Inside, the cabin was empty of furniture, just bare boards, but the floor was stained dark in multiple places. I couldn't tell if it was water damage or something else. The walls had deep scratches, vertical and horizontal, as if something had tried to claw its way out or in. I felt a cold pressure in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. My companion, who had been eager to explore, froze in place. He didn't speak, just stared at a corner of the room. I looked and saw tracks, small and oddly shaped, leading from one side of the cabin to the other. They weren't human or deer. They ended abruptly at the far wall. I wanted to leave immediately, but before I could, I heard the faintest sound, a scraping from outside. My companion suggested it might be an animal, but instinct told me otherwise. The scraping continued intermittently, around the perimeter of the cabin, circling us, sometimes closer, sometimes further. We decided to leave. I led the way back down the hill, trying to retrace our steps. The tracks we had followed were gone, replaced by leaves and mud that hadn't been disturbed. The forest felt like it had shifted, unfamiliar trees appearing where there hadn't been any, paths blocked by fallen branches that weren't there before. I realized we were no longer following a creek, and the sound of water had vanished entirely. We wandered for hours. My phone had no signal, and the sky was gray and overcast. The temperature dropped quickly, and the wind cut through my jacket. We eventually stumbled upon another path, slightly more defined, and I decided to follow it blindly. I didn't care where it led as long as it led out. The forest seemed endless, the trees forming walls around us. I began to worry that if night fell, we wouldn't find the cabin at all. Eventually, after what felt like a full day, we saw smoke rising in the distance. Relief hit me immediately. We hurried toward it, and it turned out to be the chimney of the cabin where the rest of the group had stayed. They had been worried and searching for us, and I felt a mixture of relief and anger at the same time. I told them about the cabin we had found, but they brushed it off, saying there were old hunting structures scattered in the area. I never went back to that part of the forest. In fact, the experience stayed with me, a reminder of how late autumn can change the woods entirely. I had been planning a solo hiking trip in late October in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I wanted to take advantage of the last few weeks before winter, when the forest was quiet and mostly empty. I packed light, just a tent, some food, water, and a small first aid kit. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, because I often hiked alone and didn't think it was necessary. The first day went smoothly. The trails were clear, the forest damp but manageable, and I kept a steady pace. By evening, I found a small clearing near a creek to set up camp. The temperature had dropped, and the wind rustled the remaining leaves on the trees. I slept lightly, waking several times to the occasional snap of a branch or rustle in the brush. I wasn't worried. I had been hiking alone many times. The next morning, I decided to explore further, taking a side trail that the map indicated was a loop back to the main path. After a few miles, the trail narrowed, the leaves thick on the ground, and I started noticing something odd. There were footprints in the mud, but they weren't mine, and they weren't consistent with any wildlife. They were human, but the spacing was strange, uneven, and some prints looked incomplete, like toes had slipped or been dragged. I followed the prints cautiously, thinking perhaps another hiker had passed by. After a while, the trail split in multiple directions, none of which looked familiar. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but the landmarks didn't match. The creek that was supposed to run parallel to the path was no longer visible, and the trees around me looked taller and denser than they had before. I realized I was lost. I decided to backtrack, but the footprints kept appearing, leading me deeper into the woods. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but after several hours, it became clear. The prints were deliberately guiding me somewhere. I tried to ignore them, but the forest felt alive around me, the bare branches casting dark shadows even in daylight. I felt a pressure building, a tension that I couldn't explain. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and my sense of direction was failing completely. I stumbled into a small clearing and saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a hunter's stand, elevated above the ground, looking old and abandoned. It was out of place, not marked on any map I had seen, and it had faint marks on the ladder, like someone had recently climbed it. I hesitated, but I decided to climb up, thinking I might get a better view of the area. From the top, I could see the forest stretching endlessly, trees thick and bare, no paths or trails visible. The footprints I had been following ended at the base of the stand. I scanned the forest below, and that's when I noticed movement. Not a deer, not a bird, but something human-sized, moving slowly and deliberately between the trees. I couldn't make out details, only the shape. I felt my heart race, my instincts telling me to leave immediately. I climbed down quickly, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift again. Trails I thought I had taken were gone, replaced by thick underbrush and mud. The creek was nowhere in sight. The thing I had seen was still moving in the distance, keeping its distance, but always in view. I tried calling out, hoping for another hiker, but there was no response. The forest absorbed sound. Hours passed. My legs ached, my water was low, and the sun was falling fast. I started heading in what I thought was the general direction of my camp. Eventually, I stumbled upon a faint trail, barely visible, leading downhill. I followed it, my focus entirely on moving, staying alert. Finally, I saw smoke rising in the distance, my camp. Relief hit me hard, but I didn't let my guard down. The thing I had been tracking, whatever it was, did not appear near the camp. When I reached my tent, everything seemed normal. My supplies were untouched, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. I packed quickly and left the forest the next morning. I didn't tell anyone about the footprints or the figure I had seen, because I knew it would sound insane. The forest had a way of hiding things, of making you feel lost even when you thought you knew the land. I haven't returned to that section of the Allegheny since. I stick to the marked trails now and never hike alone in late autumn. I was looking for a quiet spot to escape the city for a week, somewhere deep in the forests of West Virginia, far enough that cell service would be spotty. I found a listing for a small cabin on Dry Hollow Road, an unpaved lane that wound deep into the woods. The pictures showed a simple structure: one room, wood stove, and a porch facing a creek. The reviews were sparse but positive. I booked it, eager for isolation and a break from work. I arrived in late October, mid-afternoon, when the sun was already low. The drive from the highway was long and winding, the gravel road narrowing the further I went. Most of the forest around the road was bare, the trees skeletal, and the underbrush thick with dead leaves. I passed a few abandoned properties, old cabins and trailers that had clearly been left to rot, and it occurred to me that people either moved away long ago or something had driven them out. The cabin was exactly as advertised. It smelled of damp wood, with a faint hint of mildew. There was a stack of firewood and basic supplies, a lantern, a small propane heater, and some old blankets. I set my things down and decided to explore the immediate area. The creek ran behind the cabin, its water low but clear. I wandered along the bank, noting that the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The isolation felt peaceful at first, but there was a subtle unease in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. The first night was uneventful, though I woke several times to the sound of something scraping against the cabin walls. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound continued intermittently. It wasn't consistent, but it was deliberate, heavy enough to be more than a branch. I tried to ignore it. The next morning, I went for a hike along a faint trail behind the creek. I wanted to map out the area so I wouldn't get lost. The trail was overgrown and slippery with wet leaves. As I walked, I noticed strange markings on some of the trees, deep scratches, some vertical, some diagonal. I assumed they were claw marks from animals, but the spacing and angles seemed wrong for deer or bear. I made a mental note, but kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had walked further than intended. The forest had become confusing. Trees that had seemed familiar were suddenly gone, replaced by dense thickets that hadn't been there. I checked my phone, no signal. I tried to use the compass, but the readings seemed off, fluctuating slightly. I had never felt so disoriented in a forest before. I decided to turn back, but quickly realized I had lost the trail entirely. I wandered for hours, keeping the creek on my left as a reference point. Eventually, the sun dipped low, and I had to move quickly to find my way back to the cabin. By the time I returned, I was covered in mud, exhausted and tense. I had no explanation for how the forest had shifted around me. That night, the scraping returned, louder and closer. I stayed inside, sitting by the small propane heater, trying to keep calm. Around midnight, I heard another sound, footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening. They were slow, deliberate, moving back and forth. I considered that it might have been a raccoon or a large animal, but the weight and rhythm didn't match anything I knew. I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I told myself it was imagination, that the isolation was playing tricks on me. The next day, I decided to explore further down the gravel road to see if there were any other houses or signs of life. After about a mile, the road narrowed to nothing more than a path through trees. Fallen leaves muffled my steps, and the forest pressed in close. I noticed what looked like fresh footprints in the mud, not mine, leading off the road into the forest. I thought about following them, but something told me not to. The feeling of being watched was strong, oppressive. I returned to the cabin, trying to shake off the unease. That night, the sounds escalated. The scraping was continuous, circling the cabin, sometimes heavier on one side. I started noticing shadows moving outside the windows, just at the edge of my vision. I didn't look directly, but the sense that someone, or something, was circling the cabin was overwhelming. Sleep was impossible. On the third day, I decided to pack up and leave early. I wanted to check out and drive back before the forest became dark and disorienting. I loaded my things and started the car. As I turned onto Dry Hollow Road, I realized I didn't recognize the road. The gravel seemed different, the trees denser, and the curves unfamiliar. I assumed I had taken a wrong turn and tried to backtrack, but the forest now seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, swallowing the road entirely. Hours passed. The sun was gone. I drove slowly, hoping to find the highway. Tire tracks appeared in the mud, but none were recent, and they seemed to lead in circles. Every time I thought I had recognized a landmark, it vanished behind a bend or thicket. My phone still had no signal, and I realized I hadn't seen another car, house, or even wildlife since leaving the cabin. The forest felt deliberate now, like it was guiding me somewhere. I kept driving, praying for an end, until I came to a clearing with an old cabin in the center. It wasn't the one I had rented, but it looked abandoned. There were deep scratch marks on the door and broken boards leaning against the walls. I didn't approach. I drove past it, trying to follow what I thought was the original road, but by the time I looked back, the clearing was gone. The road itself seemed to vanish into the forest. Eventually, around 3 a.m., I found the highway. I still don't know how I managed to get there, but I kept driving without stopping until I reached a town where I could call for directions and a hotel. I never went back to Dry Hollow Road. Later, I learned from a local that the area had a history of people disappearing in the woods, especially in late autumn when the trees were bare and the forest could hide paths easily. Even now, years later, I think about the cabin and that forest. I can't explain what I experienced, only that the woods were alive in a way that made me feel trapped. I had planned a late autumn camping trip in the remote forests of northern New Hampshire. I wanted a few days alone, away from anyone else, to hike, fish, and just be in the quiet of the woods before winter fully set in. I packed light, a small tent, food for 3 days, water, a few extra clothes, and my basic first aid kit. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. The forest had plenty of trails on the map, and I assumed I would stay on them, but I didn't expect how fast the woods could change once the leaves were mostly gone. I arrived late morning and parked at a trailhead off a narrow dirt road. The air was cold and crisp, the ground damp from recent rains. The trees were nearly bare, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of wet leaves. I followed a trail that ran parallel to a creek, planning to hike a few miles before setting up camp. The trail was easy at first, clearly marked with blazes on trees, but after about 3 miles the path narrowed, branches scraping my jacket, and I noticed some areas where the trail had been washed out or covered in mud. I pressed on, thinking I would find a clearing for my tent soon. By early afternoon, I realized I had lost sight of the creek. The trail split multiple times, and the markers were faded or missing. I checked my compass and map, trying to orient myself, but it was confusing. The forest looked uniform, the same pattern of bare trees and wet leaves. I started to feel uneasy but kept moving, telling myself that I just had to keep following the trail and I would find a clearing. Hours passed. The sun began to drop low, and the shadows between the trees deepened. I finally found a small patch of flat ground to set up my tent. I ate quickly, drank some water, and tried to stay calm. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The forest was too quiet, but I kept hearing occasional noises, branches snapping, rustling leaves, distant thuds, but nothing I could identify. I told myself it was just deer or small animals moving through the underbrush. The next morning, I planned to hike back to the main road. I followed the trail I had used to reach my campsite, but it wasn't where I remembered it. Sections I had passed the day before were missing, replaced by fallen branches, deep mud, and thick underbrush. I tried to stay calm, following what seemed like the path, but the forest seemed to shift around me. Trails I thought I knew led me in circles, and the creek I had been following disappeared entirely. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. I didn't panic at first, but the isolation pressed in. I kept moving, thinking I would eventually find the main road. I crossed small streams, climbed over fallen trees, and pushed through dense brush. My feet were soaked, and my clothes were muddy. I had no idea which direction was north, south, or back to where I started. I stopped to rest and noticed tracks in the mud. Human tracks, barefoot, uneven, like someone had been limping. I followed them cautiously, hoping they would lead somewhere, but the forest seemed to close in around me as I moved. Night fell faster than I expected. I set up my tent again, this time in a small depression surrounded by trees. The darkness felt absolute, and the sounds of the forest changed. There was movement outside my tent, slow, deliberate, circling. At first, I told myself it was an animal, but the steps didn't match anything I knew. I could feel the presence moving around, waiting. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it. I stayed still for hours, trying not to breathe too loud. The next morning, I decided I had to move quickly before the forest fully swallowed the day. I packed, leaving little trace, and tried to follow a faint path I thought I remembered. By mid-morning, I was completely disoriented. Every tree looked the same. Rocks and fallen branches seemed to appear where they hadn't been before. I realized the forest was not just confusing, it was actively deceptive. I tried to follow the sun, but the low autumn sky was mostly overcast, making it hard to navigate. Hours passed. My energy was low. I drank water sparingly and ate a few bites of food. At one point, I thought I heard voices, faint, far off, but when I moved toward the sound, there was nothing. The tracks I had followed the day before were gone. I kept hearing movement around me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes all around. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing and decided to rest. As I sat, I saw movement in the trees. A figure, human-sized, moving between the trunks. It kept its distance but stayed visible. I froze, trying not to panic. I couldn't tell if it was a hunter, a hiker, or something else. The forest was empty otherwise. I watched it for what felt like an hour. Eventually, it moved away, disappearing behind a line of trees. I didn't follow. That night, I stayed awake entirely, listening, watching, waiting for sunrise. Every branch that broke, every rustle in the leaves made my heart race. I realized I had no idea which direction to go, and the forest seemed to have closed in around me completely. I spent the next day moving slowly, always careful to stay alert. Eventually, I stumbled upon a faint dirt road, and after hours of walking, I finally reached a small town. I didn't stop until I was in town limits, where I could get a phone signal and call for help. Even now, I can't explain everything I experienced in those woods. The forest in late autumn has a way of making you lose your sense of direction entirely, and I'm certain I wasn't imagining the presence that followed me.